Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today to this very special event featuring Professor Larry Diamond from Stanford. This event is sponsored by the Peninsula Democratic Coalition. I will refer to us as the PDC, and we thank the Democratic Volunteer Center for all of their help. I'm Lori Holtzberg, president of the PDC. For those of you who are not already members, the PDC is the largest and oldest Democratic club on the peninsula. We serve as a big tent for Democrats of all stripes, so I welcome all of you. Those of you who are already members, and if you're not already members, we'd love to have you join our club. Our big fundraising event this year was our summer picnic, which it is actually every year, and we were very lucky to have it live this year at Cuesta Park, and we had over 100 people attending with lots of elected officials. We were very lucky to raise over $30,000, which combined with last year's picnic fundraising allowed us to give a total of $50,000 to Democratic candidates in tight races throughout California and the country. For this event today, I'd like to give a shout out to our program committee led by Shali Sirke, and a huge thank you to Lawrence Bird of the DVC for all of his technical help. We're honored today to have Professor Larry Diamond speak on preserving our democracy. I know that a lot of you, along with me, are seeing severe warning signs threatening our precious democracy. Professor Diamond will share with us ways we can work together to ensure the safety of our democracy. So I'd now like to introduce somebody who needs absolutely no introduction, the Honorable Joe Simitian, Santa Clara County Supervisor and former state senator, who will be moderating today's event. Again, I thank you all for signing up for this very, very important program. And take it away, Joe.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you to you for your leadership of the PDC. Which is made manifest today in part by the offering of this program. Let me also welcome and thank everybody who is taking time out of a beautiful Northern California day to dig deep on an issue of importance to all of us, the state of our democracy. And of course, special thanks to Professor Larry Diamond, who it will be my privilege to introduce and also to help moderate questions for. Professor Larry Diamond is truly a Renaissance individual, a man of many hats. Just at Stanford University alone, he is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He is the Mosbacher Senior Fellow in Global Democracy at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, FSI for short. He's a Bass University Fellow in undergraduate education at Stanford as well, and a professor by courtesy of political science and sociology. So, I felt like I needed an org chart just to keep track of his many roles at the university. He leads the Hoover Institution's program on China's global sharp power and on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region. Over at FSI, he leads the program on Arab reform and democracy. Which is based, I should say, at the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, which Professor Diamond directed for more than half a dozen years. He also co-leads the Global Digital Policy Incubator, which is based at FSI. He's the founding co-editor of the Journal of Democracy, serves as a senior consultant in the International Forum for Democratic Studies with the National Endowment for Democracy, and is a prolific author, really far too many scholarly works and popularly accessible books and articles to mention. I do want to, however, reference his latest book that was edited with Orville Schell called China's Influence and American Interests. And for today's topic, particularly noteworthy are Professor Diamond's authorship of Ill Winds, Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition and American Complacency, which comes on the heels of other relevant works, including In Search of Democracy and The Spirit of Democracy. So this is someone who obviously has given great thought to the issue of the day for a very long period of time, long before it was, I think, as clear and present a concern as it is today. He's been a consultant and an advisor in a range of roles, everything from the U.S. Agency for International Development to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Baghdad years ago. So Professor Larry Diamond, let me say first, thank you for all your work over the years, illuminating these issues, and a special thanks and welcome as you share your thoughts, and then we'll go to Q&A because this is a group that has lots of questions in my experience. Welcome and thanks again.
Thank you, Joe. It's an honor to be with someone I consider to be one of the most distinguished public servants in the state of California. And fortunately, we have you right here in Santa Clara County. So it's really been a blessing to have your public service over these last several decades. I am going to share my screen because that will be the most efficient way for me to cover a lot of ground pretty expeditiously. And I will begin by giving you a kind of summary perspective of my concerns. I think we all agree that our democracy is in very serious danger. And I think a major reason why, and a lot of the other reasons are connected to this reason, is the toxic level of political polarization that we have in the United States. The Congress, but not only the Congress, many representative bodies and arenas at the state level, and now increasingly, we find deep ideological and partisan enmity in our local lives as well, has become more polarized. Congress has trouble getting anything done. That makes people more cynical about government and makes them more available to the mobilization of dangerous illiberal populists like Donald Trump. And then we've become more separated from one another. People have been sorting themselves out into urban and exurban or rural areas with very different political, social, and cultural points of view. There's growing enmity and distrust between our two major parties. People often drop out, but the ones who most often participate are the ones who, this has been particularly true on the Republican side, somewhat less so on the Democratic one, but still true to some degree, are the more intensely partisan ones. And so we're seeing, you know, particularly on the Republican side, more and more extreme candidates being nominated. You know, if they're nominated in Republican dominant states or districts, the Congress becomes still more polarized. And then you've got partisan gerrymandering in many states, making that worse. So I think people are familiar with this problem. And in recent years, we've seen trends in, of course, we've seen January 6th, which should have been a wake-up call to all of us. But we've seen other trends in public opinion that I've been watching very carefully that add to this picture of alarm. Nearly 2/3 of Americans now feel that American democracy is in crisis and at risk of failing. And interestingly, as Peter Baker noted recently in the New York Times, it's about an even number of Democrats, proportion of Democrats and Republicans who believe that. Now, obviously, they believe it for different reasons. A majority of supporters of the party and candidate that clearly lost the presidential election reject that defeat and deny the legitimacy of the candidate who won, President Biden, and increasingly are in the practice of denying any election outcome that they don't win. And obviously, you can't have a democracy in which losers refuse to accept the legitimacy of free and fair elections that they lose. A majority of Americans now lack confidence that elections in the United States will reflect the will of the people. And of course, that's even setting aside the Electoral College, which can compromise that at the national level. Members of each party in growing numbers, view the other as enemies and not just political opponents. And that may be one reason why a growing proportion of Americans, 1 in 5 in the last survey I saw, think that violence can be justified to protect American democracy, or in the case of January 6th, simply reclaim the election that they think they legitimately won, even though there's no concrete evidence to back them up. We have other deep drivers of polarization and decay: rising inequality in wealth and income, the job displacement and export that's been happening, offshoring of jobs with technological change, and then globalization, and the debates over immigration, which are now being cynically exploited, as you've seen, by ambitious populist Republican governors, continuing and deeply embedded racial bias, which is now, I think, being reflected in efforts at voter suppression in many Republican-controlled states, the geographic sorting that I referred to before, and people living in physical bubbles where they don't interact with others. And then polarization has been greatly advanced by social media, which of course are substantially based in this peninsula, and which have, I think, a really perverted and socially destructive business model of elevating and pushing what makes people angry, emotional, suspicious, hateful, conspiratorial, and so on. I can't emphasize enough how much damage I think social media are doing to our social fabric and body politic. And I won't say more about the policy responses there, but I'd be glad to talk about them. And then we have the decline of civic education in the United States, and with it, any hope of kind of an early orientation toward democratic values, compromise, and listening to and respecting different points of view. This slide, which is the data from Freedom House, shows how much the US has decayed in the quality of its democracy since the late Obama years, not due to President Obama, but due to the Republican denial of his legitimacy, the birtherism, the confrontation, the obstruction, the intolerance, and so on and so forth, to the point now where, as you see, we lag well behind our peer G7 democracies in terms of the quality of democracy. So how do we respond to and repair this? I have 6 reform priorities, only probably the first 4 of which I'm going to have time to talk about now, because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. One is to strengthen the impartiality and capacity of our electoral administration, which amazingly I did not expect a decade ago that we would be facing this problem, has come under dedicated assault by people who don't believe that there can be a free and fair election that they lose. I would like to see us expand voting rights all the way to universal voting. I'll explain that. I think ranked choice voting is an electoral reform that can help us reduce political polarization at the state and national level. And I believe that ending party primaries and going to blanket primaries, but not of the kind California has, a broader type, could make a big difference, and I'll explain that. So first of all, we have to secure elections and the right to vote. And this means we have to defend the principle that elections should be administered by people whose sole job and sole dedication is to a free, fair, inclusive, and well-administered election. I think it is a highly regrettable reality that elections in the United States are so often managed at the state level by elected officials who run on a party platform and are open to partisan pressures. Now, that's never been the case in California, in my view, but there are a lot of people running for Secretary of State who have won the Republican nomination in states like Arizona, Nevada, and Michigan, critical swing states, who deny the legitimacy of President Biden's election victory in 2020 and have pledged basically to ensure that Republicans win in 2024 and beyond, and buy into the logic that really the only possible fair election outcome is one in which their party wins, that it just can't be possible that their party would lose a free and fair election. Well, you should never have an electoral official who thinks that way and is promising to act that way. And in lieu of what I'd like to see, or until we achieve what I'd like to see, which is eliminating the election of secretaries of state or chief election officers at the state level and making it a professional, nonpartisan career position, we've got to defeat these dangerous anti-democratic figures who are running for Secretary of State in some critical states. More money is pouring into the Secretary of State elections in some of these states than has ever been seen before. But unfortunately, a lot of it is MAGA Republican money. I, of course, would like to end gerrymandering nationally, as we did in California, and have nonpartisan commissions draw election district boundaries so you don't get the kind of perversity that we see in Ohio, where Democrats win 46, 47, 48% of the vote for the House of Representatives in the state and get 4 of the 16 elected House members. I mean, this is just a travesty. And Democrats have done it too, partisan gerrymandering, and I'd say it's now a defense mechanism to ensure that try and limit the degree to which the overall distribution of seats to votes is highly unrepresentative of the popular will nationally. But we have a lot of work to do to win these battles at the state level. I would like to see national legislation banning this, but of course, that was in the Voting Rights Acts that I'm going to review for you, and we failed to pass them. Minimum national standards for voter registration, and for voter inclusion, adequate funding for federal elections, which we don't have now, and making it a federal crime. It's a tragedy that I need to utter this sentence, to threaten or commit violence against any local or state election official. I think you know that particularly in the wake of January 6th, well, in the wake of the 2020 national election, many election officials at the state and county level have been receiving death threats, and a number of them are simply retiring as a result. So election security is very important. I note here, I'm not going to read everything on these slides, what needs to be done in that regard. I hope that we can make more progress in getting federal legislation and funding to achieve these things. I will note now, in the wake of the near train wreck of the 2020 presidential election, that we must reform the broken and inscrutable and therefore extremely dangerous in its inscrutability Electoral Count Act of 1887. almost all American democracy scholars and law professors who study this issue believe it's extremely urgent that we get this done. A bipartisan group of 20 senators, Republicans and Democrats in equal number, have drafted the Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022 to clarify the role of the vice president. That is, that he or she cannot just open only the electoral votes that they care to from different states, to provide for expedited federal judicial review of disputes over state presidential election results, so that we can have states being able to send their electors forward in a clear and authoritative fashion, and therefore a provision that once the judges have ruled in a dispute, their decision becomes the conclusive slate of state electors, and Congress then has to defer to that. And they make it much more difficult for Congress to nominate or object to a state's electors, and make it much more difficult for a state to declare a failed election, which is another strategy that election denying Republicans have been considering for trying to give a Republican candidate who didn't win the presidency presidential election victory, even through the bizarre mechanism of having the House of Representatives vote, because no one gets a majority of electoral college votes. The For the People Act, the John Lewis Act, would have, Voting Rights Reform Act, would have done a lot of this that you can see here, but unfortunately it failed. It would have increased voter participation in the ways you see here. I think it's extremely important, when we can, to fully restore the 1965 Voting Rights Act and go further to make voting easier and entrench the right to vote by mail and by early voting. This is what I mean by voting standards. I think voting should be a national holiday, or we can move it to a 2-day period over a weekend. I would move our party primaries closer to the general election, as, for example, Rhode Island has after Labor Day. The Freedom to Vote Act would have done some of these things, the compromise bill, and unfortunately it failed too. I like the argument that E.J. Dionne and Miles Rappaport have made for universal voting, essentially compulsory voting, that all adults would be automatically registered to vote and required to vote in general elections, as they are in Australia or some of our other peer democracies. There'd be a modest and small penalty for non-voting, but there'd be dramatically expanded opportunities to vote and expectations to vote. And a lot of research says, social science research, that if we have a broader and more inclusive electorate, it actually will be a more moderate electorate, because again, it's the more intensely partisan voters who turn out with greater intensity. There's some compromises we might make to try and get to more inclusive voting that would combine a photo ID to vote, and I can explain how that might work, with a much stronger campaign to ensure that everyone gets a government-issued photo ID, which I think is very important, is almost a human right now, and has much more ample opportunities to vote. With respect to polarization, I think that it's not a surprising thing to have a polarized system when there are only two parties. And then the primary election process in recent decades draws one party more and more to the extreme right. And I don't think the process has been nearly so polarizing on the left, but there's been a more modest tendency in that direction. And I think, and a lot of political scientists believe, that first past the post voting in general elections, allowing only a plurality to prevail has contributed to this. So one of the reforms I would favor is ranked choice voting, where if nobody gets a majority of first preference votes, then you have an instant runoff, and the candidate with the lowest number of first preference votes is eliminated. And you keep having instant runoffs until somebody emerges with a majority of the vote. In a lot of instances, the first time this was used in a federal election was for Congress in Maine, after Maine adopted ranked choice voting in 2018. And it resulted in a kind of MAGA Republican losing to a more moderate Democrat. And you all know what just happened in Alaska, where the Democrat started with 37% of the vote in a three-way race, and eventually prevailed with the majority of the vote and the legitimacy that goes with it, defeating Sarah Palin in the ranked choice voting election. There are a lot of reasons why I like ranked choice voting. I think it's a moderate reform, whereas proportional representation, I think, would be a more radical roll of the dice for the United States, although there's growing interest in it. It would end the spoiler problem. So if independents or Green Party, Libertarian, I mean, I'm a Democrat with a small d as well as a large d. So I think voters should have more choice. And this way, you know, people would be liberated to vote for creative candidates as their first preference. And if they don't make it, they could vote for their second choice and have it count if nobody gets a majority of the vote. We do know from a lot of experience around the world that this tends to encourage broad coalition formation. It produces majority winners in the end by definition, at least in terms of the distribution of the remaining valid votes. It can, I think, generate a healthy new dose of competition and freshness in our election campaigns. Ranked choice voting campaigns, some social science research has shown, tend to result in less negative campaigning because it becomes a little more complicated to know who you're targeting the negative ads at. And, you know, if you engage in negative campaigning, you can destroy your opponent, but you wind up looking pretty nasty too. And if there's a third choice to decamp to, it makes it harder to engage in it. So I like the combination. I like what Alaska did, basically, the combination of ranked choice voting with the blanket primary that we have, the nonpartisan primary in California. But in this case, Alaska sends not 2, but 4 candidates to the general election. And then people can use ranked choice voting to choose among the final 4. Nevada has an item on their ballot this November, a voter initiative to have top 5 voting. And the same logic prevails, but with an important twist. I think a major reason why we have seen the Republican Party move toward the extreme right, the MAGA anti-democratic election denying and extreme ideological right, is because in order to run in the general election, they need to win the party primary. And party primaries are low turnout affairs that are dominated by candidates who appeal to the extremes. And you only need about 8, 9, 10% of the electorate in a typical state to win a party primary. And so if you're running in a Republican primary and you appeal to the most extreme 8, 9%, you know, then that's what you need to get to the general election. And then if it's a state like Texas or a congressional district that's heavily Republican, you're almost guaranteed to win. There's some interesting innovations that people are thinking about and that I hope California will think about. How do we get reform? Well, I think the main way we're going to get it is the way we got it in California with Top 2, the way Maine got it with ranked choice voting, the way Alaska got it in 2020 by voter initiative, although the voter initiative for RCV lost in Massachusetts. It's been winning in a number of municipalities, and I particularly would like to see progress at the state level. Lots of other progress, I think, is being made for democracy at the state level through voter initiatives to create independent redistricting commissions in a number of states like Colorado and Michigan have joined this, Utah, automatic voter registration in Michigan. Florida adopted a voter initiative to restore voting rights to more than 1 million convicted felons in the state of Florida. And then, of course, the Republican legislature in Florida nullified and removed that provision from state law because they felt that it would disadvantage Republicans. And we've got some more recent measures, including the very good initiative that was adopted in Oregon 2 years ago that reforms campaign finance, I think, in some promising ways, including limiting campaign contributions and spending and requiring much more radical transparency. I think with that, I've got a lot more to say, but I also want a conversation. So I'll turn it over to Joe Simidian.
We have a number of questions that were submitted in advance, but I want to encourage folks, if they haven't already discovered the Q&A function on their screens, to find their way to the Q&A function. That is where questions can be entertained. And I have some starter questions because folks did submit questions in advance. But again, for those of you who have questions, there's every opportunity to submit them. And we've got some screeners standing by to try and make sure we get to as many questions as we can during the time allotted. Professor Diamond, you alluded to this in a couple of instances, but we have some very direct questions, and I'm just going to pull my my notes here from our friend AC, who says, "What are the effective, practical things that we in a deep blue state can do to help preserve democracy in red or purple states?" Our president, Lori, has been very focused on asking what, as a large club, the PDC, the Peninsula Democratic Coalition, could do to influence the elections and uphold democracy. And I've got a follow-up there, but I think, what's clear to me from some of these questions is we've got people who want to know, is there a sort of a tangible thing or things they can do? And why don't I turn it to you?
Okay, great. I think the future of the near-term future of American democracy is not mainly going to be decided by elections in California this year, right? There are some swing districts that could decide whether the Democrats can hold on to the Congress by 1 or 2 seats. One of them is not that far from here, where Josh Harder is running for re-election in the Modesto, Stockton area, a Stanford alum. And, if he wins and maybe we can capture a couple of the seats like Valadaos and 1 or 2 down south where Republicans are being challenged by Democrats, it could make a difference in the House of Representatives. So I'd say point number 1, don't neglect the swing congressional districts. And even though I love our representative in Palo Alto, Anna Eshoo, she's, I don't think, at risk of defeat. Then I'd say the critical elections are in the swing states: Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, I would add Ohio, maybe Georgia, although the governor and secretary of state in Georgia are not election deniers. But I think maybe the most important election in the country now is for governor of Pennsylvania. It is the largest swing state in the country in electoral votes. The Democratic candidate for governor, and by the way, there's a great article about him in Politico magazine that I strongly recommend. Josh Shapiro is his name. He's not only a very good candidate, and he's been an excellent and democracy defending attorney general for the state of Pennsylvania, but he is running against one of the most extreme, frightening, unabashedly white Christian nationalist extremists of any Republican candidate in the country. So what I would say for Josh Shapiro's race for governor of Pennsylvania, I would say for Tony Evers' race for governor of Wisconsin, Governor Whitmer's race for governor of Michigan, though I think she's in a little better shape. The races, oh my God, the woman who is running for governor of Arizona, who's another extreme MAGA Republican election denier, but a very compelling candidate because she's a former Phoenix TV newscaster, so everybody knows her, and she's a familiar face. These people are extreme election deniers, and it just goes way beyond the normal desire to have Democrats win over Republicans. It's now, can we have democracy win over election denialism? So I think the obvious things that Democratic clubs elsewhere, like in the peninsula in California, could do would be to, one, contribute money to those candidates, but two, to help to turn out the vote in those elections on November 8th. And there are three ways to do that. One way would be to make contact with the local Democratic clubs and offer to write postcards to voters. There's mechanisms to do this. I have a friend who's been doing it for the elections in Georgia, handwritten postcards urging people to turn out to vote. It seems to make a difference. Number two, to volunteer to make calls for that. These organizations in our peer states need volunteers, and a lot of the volunteering can be done remotely. And then three, I'd say probably very few people are going to get on a plane and fly to Philadelphia, but it could make a difference to drive to Modesto or Stockton and help Josh Harder's campaign turn out the vote.
All right, thank you. Very, very hands-on, very practical, which is what I think our questioners were asking. Pat Starrett, thanks for the question, which I'm about to share, which is a little bit more probing in some ways, which is, Professor Diamond, how do we share our ideas with those who seem to no longer value democracy? Or are we just stuck with this partisan divide, this polarization?
Thank you. One of the things I wanted to talk about is a project we have at Stanford at our Deliberative Democracy Lab to promote deliberation among Americans across very wide divides. We actually brought a random sample of 523 Americans from all over the country to Dallas, Texas in September of 2019 to hold open and reliably informed, because we prepared fair and balanced briefing papers, conversations on a lot of the issues dividing us: immigration, the environment, healthcare, and so on. And in the process of having these structured deliberations, people did change. Some people changed their views on the issues, but in particular, they came to see that members of the other party were not devils with horns, that they were human beings who had, similar aspirations for their children and anxieties that may have been driven by some things that we wouldn't agree with, but that, that you could have a conversation about. So I think we need to have more conversations across the divides. Now, fortunately, we've been able to develop an online platform for deliberation that I think holds the promise of scaling up these structured conversations to much larger numbers of people. But I'd say we need to reach out through our networks, our faith networks, our Rotary clubs, our trade unions, whatever, and see if we can have divides across social and geographic distance. And even in California, this gulf exists. Again, for example, between a lot of people who live in affluent coastal areas and a lot of people who live in less affluent rural areas. So I think we need to seek out and try to structure thoughtful, open-ended, mutually respectful dialogues across difference.
Thank you. And you mentioned the development of an online platform for some of those dialogues. Is that a platform that is up and running and available and accessible to folks in the club who are listening today?
Well, we're not yet at a point where we can just plug in volunteers to join a conversation. There are some other experiments underway that will plug individuals in with a different other from a different part of the country for an online conversation. But I think we may not be that far away. So if people want to visit the website of the Deliberative Democracy Lab at Stanford University, they can learn more about that. And
all right, good. I'm going to say that name again. That's the Deliberative Democracy Lab at Stanford University for folks who are looking to find their way there. Yes.
And it's just it's CDD at stanford.edu.
Professor Diamond, I had to smile because earlier you said, want to get to questions, but I'll try and get back to the Supreme Court when time permits. And sure enough, I went straight to questions, and we had not one, but at least a couple of questions about the Supreme Court and your thoughts on potential appropriate reforms, both from Ben. Thank you for the question, Ben, and from Carol. So what are your thoughts about where we might go with the situation we're confronting right now at the Supreme Court level?
Well, part of the plight that Democrats face is just the dumb luck of the draw that we have had in the last 46 years, 24 years of Republican presidents and 22 years of Democratic presidents. But the way, if you set aside Mitch McConnell's mischief in blocking Merrick Garland, which was not, an act of God, but an act of a person. But otherwise, the way retirements and deaths have played out, Republicans have gotten lucky and have named the vast majority of Supreme Court justices in those 46 years, even though it's been almost an even split in terms of who controlled the White House. So I think so one problem is it's just open to random fate in a way that isn't necessarily, quote, fair. The second problem is that our justices are serving too long, period, full stop. There is no other advanced industrial democracy that has neither a term limit nor an age limit for their constitutional court judges. We are the only one. And so you open up the possibility, a very real possibility, that Amy Coney Barrett, who's pretty vital, healthy woman and was nominated in her late 40s, could be on the court for 40 years. And I think this is just wrong. I don't favor a short term of 5, 6, 8 years, but I do favor a term limit. And so I like the bill that Ro Khanna is co-sponsoring, our own Ro Khanna, where there would be an 18-year limit for Supreme Court justices, and there would be a provision that every president would nominate a Supreme Court justice in the first and third years of their 4-year term. And so every president would nominate 2 Supreme Court justices to an 18-year term. And over time, you know, those 9 justices would cycle out, and then there'd be another 9 justices after 18 years, but every 2 years one would retire. Now the question is, what do you do about the existing Supreme Court? And the answer, unfortunately, in my view, is you just leave them there, because the judgment is it might be considered unconstitutional, but in any case, it would be politically impossible to force their retirement. And so the result would be a temporary expansion of the Supreme Court until the justices appointed under the old rules eventually rotated off. But that is my solution. I think it's not unthinkable, because if you have Democrats in the White House for long enough, this may start looking appealing to Republicans. So, and it's, you know, behind the veil of uncertainty of the future. So no one knows. It's not stuffing Democrats onto the court. It's stuffing or nominating every 2 years nominees of whoever the president may be. It could be another Republican.
All right, thank you for that. We have a question, and this is what I love about the constituents I represent and the club members in particular. We have a question that shows up, I think, a considerable degree of attention to and knowledge about the various debates out there right now. Peter Landsberger asks, could you say a word or two about the independent state legislature doctrine, which has may be addressed by the Supreme Court this term. Peter thinks it will be. And why don't I ask you to begin, Professor John, by just sharing with the club members what the independent state legislature doctrine is, because it's perhaps something not everyone is familiar with.
Well, it's dubious and dangerous legal theory that says state legislatures have extremely wide, maybe absolute authority to do whatever they want to the electoral process, not only to extremely gerrymander districts and suppress the vote however they want, but even to overturn elections if they think they don't meet whatever standards they apply, and therefore to nullify elections, and to make elections undemocratic. One element of this would enable a state legislature to say, and this is a potential interpretation of the Constitution, because it's the way states initially chose their electors, that the electors will not be chosen by the popular vote in the state, but by the state legislature. So what happens if the a heavily Republican Arizona state legislature says in January of 2024, oh, the polls aren't looking so good in Arizona. Even if we try and, manipulate the vote, suppress the vote, we might still lose the presidential election in Arizona. So we'll declare now that the popular vote for president in Arizona will be advisory, and the state legislature will decide who the electors are. And then there are all sorts of other weird elements to this that could enable state legislatures to really just massacre democratic norms and procedures with abandon and just do literally whatever they want.
All right, thank you for that reaction. We have a question that comes up often in my experience, which is, what about the Electoral College? And Laura Snabel says, you know, as a California voter, tired of swing state voters having more power than she, do you think we should get rid of the Electoral College so that every vote, everyone's vote everywhere has the same value? And if that didn't work or wasn't possible, might it be more fair if each state at least split their Electoral College votes by the percentage each party won in their state? Thoughts about the seemingly never-ending conversation around the Electoral College, Professor?
Okay, so of course I favor eliminating the Electoral College. I think it's a profoundly anti-democratic institution as it has evolved to this point. And particularly the way it's working out now, that the only way, with the 2004 election being a narrow exception, that it seems Republicans can win the presidency is by losing the popular vote, but by winning the Electoral College. I can guarantee you, as a political scientist, that if we did not have the Electoral College, we would not have such extreme Republican presidential candidates, because they would keep losing the popular vote and they would realize they have to moderate their positions in order to win elections. And eventually they would do so, and we'd have a healthier democracy. But in any case, it's just patently unfair, and I strongly support getting rid of it. The problem is that there is zero chance in my lifetime, and I think probably in the lifetime of anybody on this Zoom, of amending the Constitution to eliminate the Electoral College. So what otherwise could we do? The only other fix I see that is at all likely to help is the National Interstate Popular Vote Compact, which was actually thought up and coordinated by one of our own community members here in Los Altos. And it is a bill that has been passed by states that account for 191 electoral votes. And the bill says, when this bill is passed by states that account for 270 electoral votes, which would be a majority, then our state's electors and all of their states' electors will be chosen, will go not to the individual that wins the popular vote in our state, but to the individual who wins the national popular vote. So that would be a way of ensuring that the argument goes, the theory goes, that the winner of the national popular vote would win. Now, here's the irony. Some people think that the Supreme Court would overturn this. On the other hand, some people also fear that the Supreme Court may validate the independent state legislature theory. And so if the independent state legislature theory is validated in any degree, then state legislatures can do what they want, including what I just described. But unfortunately, I don't think we have the political muscle right now, the votes in the remaining states we would need to get this bill adopted by states that account for 270 electoral votes because of gerrymandering of state legislatures.
Thank you. Your comments about the electoral college, excuse me, and the national strategies to address it, short of a constitutional amendment, were in fact responsive to another question that came in. So you anticipated that one nicely, Professor. I want to remind folks that we do have the Q&A function still available. So if you have a question that you've been thinking, you know, I haven't heard them talk about this, that, or the other yet, now's your time. But I'm gonna ask a couple of questions, Professor, and we'll try and keep the answers relatively brief to squeeze in some more questions from our participants today. But let me just ask, I was struck as I reviewed your resume that a lot of your work is international in scope and perspective, certainly in Asia and in the Middle East, and you've looked at authoritarian regimes in other parts of the world, the former Soviet Union. How does all of that inform your thinking about what's happening here in the United States? Is it relevant, or is it a different case and conversation altogether?
It's extremely relevant, and thank you for the question, because it's personally for me a very important one. You know, Joe, I started out, and for most of my career, I've been a scholar of comparative democracy. And that's really meant that I've focused on democratic development almost everywhere in the world except the United States, which I've been active in personally, but you know, have not devoted my scholarly attention to. But as we have fallen into deeper and deeper polarization and defection from democratic norms and therefore democratic crisis in the United States, I've turned a lot of my attention to the problems of American democracy. And in doing so, I've been able to recognize many of the elements and warning signs of democratic crisis and decay that I've seen in other countries in the world surfacing here. So one of the things the international perspective has done is made me more aware of how much trouble we're in, because I see familiar signs that other political scientists who study other countries in the world and study other historical experiences have seen. The second thing is that I know from my study of other democracies that there are many things we could do and should do. I know how much an outlier we are in our practices. I will repeat, we're the only advanced industrial democracy that has this crazy system of elected officials on party tickets administering elections. What's the logic of that? We're one of the only ones that puts our judges to election. I don't ever want to vote for a judge. I think they should be nominated, serve a term, serve for life, whatever, but they shouldn't have to face the voters, in my opinion. At the congressional level, one more example, most democracies have independent anti-corruption agencies that monitor and act on ethics violations of the Congress and the executive branch. We're one of the few advanced democracies where congressional ethics, you know, are almost exclusively handled by the members of Congress. Well, what do you get as a result of that? What you saw on the front page of the New York Times this week, dozens and dozens of members of Congress buying and trading stocks in the you know, sectors that they regulate on their committees.
Understood. Well, let me, I want to be respectful of your time and of the time of our participants, but I want to close with this question before I turn things back over to Lori for a couple of final remarks. You know, Professor Diamond, obviously your work reflects a deep concern. The participation of folks today in this conversation reflects a deep concern. Are you optimistic or not about the future of American democracy, both in the near or midterm, I'll call that, the next 5 to 10 years, are things going to get better or worse? And then in the long term. So optimistic or not, and a little bit about why or why not.
Okay. Well, in the long term, I'm always optimistic because I believe in democracy, and I'm also a long-term optimist. I have taken recently to quoting a phrase. I'm reluctant to say where the phrase comes from because he's a very famous Italian Marxist. And if I quote him, then, someone might say, oh, you see, these Democrats, they're always quoting Marxists. But his name was Antonio Gramsci, and he said, we must have pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And that's kind of where I am right now. I am really seriously worried. I think there is a very serious chance of a breakdown of democracy in the 2024 presidential election. If we lose the governorship and the Secretary of State positions that can affect the regulation of elections in states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona, and so on, if we lose them all, it could be game over. They could rig the system so that it's almost impossible for a Democratic presidential candidate to get to 270 electoral votes, even if they win by 18 million popular votes instead of the 8 million that Biden won by. And even if we, narrowly prevail again with a free and fair election in 2024, I think you could see, particularly if Trump is the candidate, violence on a much larger level and more distributed than we saw on January 6th. So I think we have a lot of work to do to secure elections, to get honest and fair people into positions of authority and so on. But I am heartened by the fact, and this is the kind of optimism of the will, that a lot of people are taking this challenge seriously, including donors who may be Democrats, but also donors who are lifelong Republicans and just don't want to see democracy fail in the United States of America. And I think a growing number of Americans of varying political stripes are having conversations like the one we've been having in the last hour. So I am optimistic that we'll meet this challenge and that we'll probably narrowly avert a worst case scenario. But we are in, I'm sorry to say, I don't like to close on this note, we are in extreme danger.
All right. Well, I think I will turn it over to our president, Lori Holzberg, for some closing remarks after saying thank you to you, Professor Diamond. And I'm going to take that as a call to action, an exhortation that we have work to do. So, Lori, let me say thank you to Professor Diamond. Thank you to everyone who's participated, but turn to you, Lori, to tell us what do we have on our to-do list at the PDC and how can we all have an impact? Thank you again, Professor Larry Diamond. Take care.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Diamond, for your very eloquent and practical presentation, although somewhat scary, I have to say. Thank you, Joe, for being such a great moderator. And thank you, Lawrence, for your expert technological skills. And I thank you all of you attendees for attending. And now let's get to work. Here are ways to volunteer. You can go to the peninsulademocrats.com to learn more about the PDC. And you can also volunteer. We have a beautiful Democratic Volunteer Center in Mountain View, 2124 El Camino. You can get signs to put on your lawns. You can go down to phone bank, write letters, postcards. You will meet lots of very competent people there who can help you. Well, now we have our marching orders, and now let's get to work. Thank you all.